Slocum, Texas is a small place. If you drove through it today, you would barely register that you had an unincorporated community in the piney woods of East Texas, in Anderson County, down near Palestine. A couple hundred people, some houses scattered along the farm roads, but tall trees closing in on either side. There is almost nothing there to tell you that anything ever happened, but something did happen here. On a July morning in 1910, this quiet stretch of woods became the site of one of the deadliest racial massacres in American history, an event in which a mob of armed white men, by some estimates hundreds strong, hunted down and shot their black neighbors across the countryside, chasing them through these same woods and creeks, shooting fleeing men in the back until the ground was scattered with bodies that the sheriff said the buzzards would find before any search party could. The official death count was 8. The people who lived through it said the real number was closer to 200. Consider what that comparison actually means. Most people have at least heard the name Tulsa now, or Rosewood, the black communities destroyed by white mobs that have in recent years finally entered the national conversation. Slocum came before both of them, and by the higher estimates it killed more people than either, and almost no one has ever heard of it. It is a strong candidate for the deadliest racial massacre in American history that you were never taught about, and the reason you were never taught about it is not an accident. It is the direct result of the century of deliberate forgetting that is the second half of this story. And then, in a way that is almost harder to believe than the killing itself, the whole thing was made to disappear, not just unpunished, erased, left out of the Texas history books, kept out of the state's own official historical record for a century, denied when the descendants of the dead came, asking for so much as a roadside marker by the very county where it happened. For 100 years, one of the worst mass killings of black Americans in the country's history was treated officially as though it had never occurred at all. This is the story of the Slocum Massacre, a place, a morning, a mob, and 100 years of silence. To understand what happened, you have to understand what Slocum was before that July, because the thing that was destroyed was not nothing. It was a community. In 1910, the Slocum area was home to a substantial, and in places majority, black population, many of them the children and grandchildren of people who had been enslaved in East Texas, who after emancipation had done the almost impossible thing. They had acquired land, they farmed, they owned property. There were black families in and around Slocum who had built up real holdings. A man named Jack Holly, for instance, a freedman, had built a granary, a dairy, and a general store. These were people who, 2 generations out of slavery, had scratched a measure of independence and even prosperity out of the East Texas dirt. And that, as much as anything, appears to be what got them killed, because the thing that is hardest to accept about Slocum is that there was no real trigger. In so many of these massacres, there is at least an alleged incident, a supposed crime, a rumor of an assault some spark the mob points to as justification, however false. At Slocum, even that is thin to the point of vanishing. There are competing accounts of what supposedly set it off. A dispute over a debt owed to a black man, a disagreement over road work, a vague rumor that black residents were arming and planning an uprising. But every serious account, then and now, agrees that these were pretexts, and flimsy ones. There was no black uprising, there was no plot. The rumor of armed black men planning to attack white families was, in the words of the record, a gross mischaracterization, an invention. What there was underneath the rumors was resentment of black families who owned land and did well, and a local white man named Jim Spurger, described in the accounts as a known agitator, who moved through the area stoking the fear, spreading the story that the black population was arming for an attack, whipping white residents into the belief that they had to strike first. They struck first, and here is the tell, the thing that exposes the whole self-defense story for the lie it was. When it was over, the sheriff could not find a single armed black mob, a single attacked white family, a single shred of the uprising that had supposedly justified everything. What he found was black people dead all over the countryside and white men who had killed them. The violence began at daybreak on Friday, July 29th, 1910, near Sadler's Creek, and Slocum was not an isolated aberration. It sat inside a long, grim pattern of racial violence in East Texas and across the South in the decades after the Civil War, a pattern in which the specific target, again and again, was black prosperity, the formula repeated from place to place. Wherever black families out of slavery managed to acquire land and build something of their own, resentment gathered, and a spark, real or invented, would set off a wave of violence that killed people and drove the survivors off their property. It happened at Slocum. It had happened elsewhere in Texas, at places like Milliken decades earlier. It would happen again at Rosewood in Florida, at Akoi at Tulsa. The through line is not random hatred. It is land and money, the deliberate, violent removal of black people from ground they had come to earn, and the transfer of that ground to white hands. Slocum was one especially bloody execution of a strategy that was being run in different forms all across the country. 3 young black men, Charlie Wilson, Cleveland Larkin, and a teenager named Willistus Holly, whom everyone called Lusk, were walking down a dirt road that morning on their way to tend to family livestock. They were doing nothing but walking to work, and they came around a bend and found themselves face to face with a mob of armed white men who opened fire on them without a word. Cleveland Larkin was killed. Charlie Wilson and Lusk Holly ran and survived, Lusk only because, after being shot, he fell and lay dead, lying motionless among the trees while the mob moved on and then dragged himself away. These 3 young men, ambushed on a dirt road on their way to feed the animals, were the first casualties of the Slocum Massacre, and it was only the beginning of the morning, because what happened next was not a riot, and it was not a battle, it was a hunt. Word of the shooting spread, and the mob did not disperse. It grew. Armed white men came from all over Anderson County and beyond, gathering into groups. Some accounts describe bands of 6 or 7 men. Others describe mobs of 30 or 40. Some reports put the total number of armed white men in the hundreds, and by some estimates as high as 1,000. And they fanned out across the countryside, going road to road and house to house, and they began systematically to shoot every black person they could find. The black residents of Slocum understood very quickly what was happening, and they ran. They abandoned their homes, their farms, everything they had built. Jack Holly left behind the granary and the dairy and the store he had built with his own hands, and they fled into the woods, across the creeks, into the marshes and the thick East Texas timber, trying to disappear, trying to get their families to safety, and the mob chased them. This is the detail that tells you exactly what Slocum was. The white mobs trailed the fleeing black families into the forests and the swamps, and they shot them as they ran, shot them in the back as they tried to escape. This was not men defending their homes from an attack. There was no attack. This was armed men running down unarmed, terrified people through the woods and killing them from behind. Men, and by some accounts women and children among the victims, cut down as they fled for their lives across their own county. The story of Lusk Holly is worth staying with because it puts a single human face on what fleeing through the woods actually meant. 16 years old, some accounts say a little older, he had already seen his own brother Alex shot and killed. He himself was shot, and he survived the next hours only by falling to the ground and lying absolutely still, playing dead, while armed men moved through the woods around him, looking for anyone still breathing. Imagine the discipline of that terror. A teenager, wounded, forcing himself to lie motionless beside the body of his brother, breathing shallow, waiting for the footsteps and the voices to move far enough away that he could crawl off and live. He made it. He eventually moved to Fort Worth, carrying that morning with him for the rest of his life. His was one of the survival stories. There were others who did not get to fall and play dead in time. The killing went on through that day and into the night, and then into the next day, spilling south across the county line into Houston County. For the better part of 2 days, The piney woods of East Texas were a killing ground, and the local authorities, to their limited credit, did not all look away, which is part of how we know how bad it was. The Anderson County Sheriff, a man named William Black, came into the area and saw what was happening, and what he said about it is some of the most damning testimony in the whole record. He told the New York Times, plainly, men were going about killing Negroes as fast as they could find them. And then he added the sentence that strips away every excuse the mob would ever offer. These Negroes have done no wrong that I can discover. The sheriff himself on the scene could find no crime, no uprising, no justification, nothing but black people being hunted and killed as fast as white men could locate them. He also said something that haunts the entire question of how many died. Asked how many had been killed, Sheriff Black said it was going to be difficult to know because the bodies were scattered all over the woods, and that the buzzards would likely find many of them before any person did. Think about what that sentence actually means. It means there were so many bodies spread across so wide an area of forest and swamp that no one could count them, and that many of the dead would simply be lost out there, never recovered, never named. And that is the heart of the terrible uncertainty about the death toll. The number officially recorded was tiny. The murders of 8 men were formally documented, and their names: Survive, Cleveland Larkin, Alex Holly, Sam Baker, Dick Wilson, Jeff Wilson, Ben Dancer, John Hayes, and Will Burley. 8 names. The newspapers at the time reported somewhere between 8 and 22 dead, but the people of the black community, the ones who fled and survived and lost family, said the real number was far higher. At least 40, they said, and quite possibly up to 200. Some estimates run to 10 times the official count. The truth is that no one will ever know, and the reason no one will ever know is itself part of the crime. The bodies were scattered in the woods where the buzzards found them. Many were never recovered. Some were said to have been buried in unmarked mass graves. The victims were black in East Texas in 1910, and the systems that count and record the dead did not consider them worth the counting. The uncertainty is not a gap in the story. It is the story. A society that will not even number its dead has already told you exactly how much it valued their lives. The killing was large enough that it could not be entirely contained within East Texas, and word of it traveled. In Washington, D.C., more than 150 black ministers gathered and wrote a letter to President William Howard Taft and to the American public, pleading with the nation to respond to what had happened at Slocum, warning that a country that kept ignoring this kind of racial violence was losing its moral foundation. They opened their letter by saying they wished the meeting had not been necessary at all. It was one of the earliest signs of what would become a recurring, agonizing pattern across the century. Black Americans, in the wake of a massacre, forced to stand up and beg the country to simply acknowledge that they had been killed. The response from the highest levels of the government was essentially nothing. The president did not act. The nation's attention moved on within days, as it always did. For a brief moment, it looked as though there might actually be justice. The scale of the killing was too large and too public to fully ignore. It had made state and national newspapers. Judges ordered the saloons closed and the gun and ammunition stores shut. The state militia and the Texas Rangers were sent into the area to restore order, and a Palestine judge named Benjamin Gardner convened a grand jury and stood before it and said something extraordinary for a white Southern official in 1910. He told the jurors, all of them white men, all of them Southern men, that it was their duty to investigate the murder of a large number of Negroes, at least 8, and possibly 10 or 12 or more, who had been killed by men of their own color. He did not flinch from calling it murder. The grand jury actually indicted 7 men on 22 counts of murder. For a moment, the machinery of justice appeared to be turning, and then it simply stopped. The case was transferred out of the county, moved to Harris County, and there it was, quietly ignored. It went nowhere. Not one of the men indicted for the Slocum Massacre was ever convicted. Not one served time. The killers went back to their lives in the same county, often on the same roads, as neighbors to the families of the people they had hunted through the woods. Justice was raised briefly like a hand, and then it was let fall, and nothing happened to anyone ever. And then came the second death of Slocum, the erasure. Because once the killing was done, and the killers were free, the story began, deliberately, to disappear. The black families who had fled mostly did not come back. Many had lost everything, their land, their homes, their businesses, the accumulated work of 2 generations out of slavery, and they resettled elsewhere in Palestine, in Oakwood, in Fort Worth, some of them, like the Holly family, even changing the spelling of their name from Holly to Holly, putting distance between themselves and what had happened. The thriving black land-owning community that had existed around Slocum was shattered and scattered, and the land they had owned passed, conveniently, into other hands. The massacre accomplished exactly what such massacres were designed to accomplish: the removal of black people and the transfer of black property. And the wider world was encouraged to forget. The Slocum Massacre was left out of the Texas public school curriculum. It was omitted from the Handbook of Texas, the authoritative reference work on the state's history published by the Texas State Historical Association. The official memory of Texas simply did not include it. For decade after decade, a mass killing that may have taken dozens or hundreds of lives was treated as though it had never happened. It was not a secret exactly. It was something more deliberate than a secret. It was a decision, made and remade over 100 years, not to remember. People who would not let it be forgotten were, as they so often are, the descendants of the dead. Chief among them, a woman named Constance Holly Jawide, the great-great-granddaughter of Jack Holly, the freedman who had built the granary and the dairy and the store and lost it all in the flight through the woods, along with a Fort Worth writer and historian named E.R. Bills, who researched the massacre and wrote a book about it, calling it what it was, an act of genocide in East Texas. She led the fight to force Slocum back into the historical record, and even that fight, a full century later, met resistance that tells you the erasure was never really over. When the descendants applied to the Anderson County Historical Commission, the local body in the very county where the massacre happened, for a historical marker to acknowledge the dead, they were turned down. The county rejected the request. It took going over the county's head to the Texas Historical Commission at the state level to finally win approval. In 2011, the Texas legislature passed a resolution formally acknowledging the massacre, and in January of 2016, more than 105 years after the killing, a historical marker was at last dedicated south of Slocum on a farm road, bearing the names of the 8 documented dead, and telling, in a few paragraphs of bronze, the story that Texas had spent a century refusing to tell. One marker on a country road for a massacre that may have killed 200 people. It is not justice. Justice was possible only in 1910, in that Harris County courtroom where the case was allowed to die, and that possibility is 100 years gone. What the marker is an acknowledgement, the barest one, wrung out of a reluctant county by the stubborn love of the descendants of the people who were hunted through those woods. So this is what remains of Slocum, a quiet community in the East Texas pines, a couple hundred people, farm roads running off through the trees, a single historical marker that the county did not want, 8 names in bronze standing in for a number no one will ever know, in the woods themselves, the same creeks and timber and marshland where, on a July morning in 1910, men were hunted down and shot in the back as they ran and left where they fell for the buzzards to find, because the world had decided they were not even worth counting. They came for the land and the lives of people who had done nothing but build something out of nothing, 2 generations out of slavery. They killed as many as they could find. They walked away without a single conviction, and then they nearly erased the whole thing from history. But it happened. It happened here, in these woods, on the 29th of July, 1910, and now you know their names: Cleveland Larkin, Alex Holly, Sam Baker, Dick Wilson, Jeff Wilson, Ben Dancer, John Hayes, Will Burley, and the far larger number of names that were never written down at all. The buzzards found them first. It has taken more than a century for anyone else to come looking. The least we can do is refuse now to let them disappear again.